There's still, we've had 300 people sign up and people are still coming through, which is fantastic. But I'm going to kick us off. My name's Duncan Shrubsole. I'm Director of Policy, Communications and Research at Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. Please do read the welcome screen. And if you want to introduce yourself on the chat, please do. We're using a Zoom webinar format. So if you're worried, you won't be able to be seen or heard. It just means it works well for sharing information. We're delighted to welcome you to today's event, discussing all things small charities and data and resources and learning, and launching 2 new resources. Just to give you some housekeeping before we start, as said, we're on the webinar format. So you can submit questions during the event through the Q&A function, and you can chat on Zoom to share reflections. But please do use those channels differently. When we get to a conversation later, we'll only be able to see the questions in the Q&A format. So please do post those questions there and use the chat for reflections and comments. If you have any technical problems, you can message the panelists on the chat box and someone will pick it up. As said in the chat and sent out in the material in advance, we've released 2 resources today: the website smallcharitiesdata.org and a research document, Small Charities Responding to COVID-19, a winter update, updating what we've learned from some of the charities that we partner with about how they've responded to COVID. As well as listening to the speakers today and engaging through the chat and Q&A, if you'd like to share more widely, please use the hashtag #SmallCharitiesData. As said, we have a full house today of, at the moment, we've got well over 100 people signed up who have joined us today. We've got people from a whole range of funders, from community foundations to national funders. We've got government from DCMS, Home Office, MOJ and the Welsh Government. We've got small charities, a wide range on issues from homelessness, rape, sexual abuse, literacy, mental health, criminal justice and travellers, infrastructure organisations of all kinds, and some large charities. And in terms of geography, we cross the UK from Cornwall to Durham, the Isle of Wight to Scotland, Wales to London. In terms of the agenda, that's as set out on the slide. We are beginning with talking through the 2 bits of research that we're launching today. And then we're going to have a discussion and broaden out and get some responses from Small Charities Coalition and NCVO, have a chance to respond to some of your questions, and then Paul Street's Lloyds Bank Foundation CEO will wrap up. It's quite a tight agenda, but we all appreciate everyone's had a lot of Zoom sessions, so we wanted to kind of pack it in just an hour, but it's very much a taster, a bite size, share the material, and we hope you will engage today, tomorrow, and in the weeks and months ahead in what the Small Charities Data offers. What's this all about? Why does this all matter? Well, at Lloyds Bank Foundation, we turn 35 years old this year. Indeed, on Sunday, we are 35 years old, and we are and always have been passionate about small and local charities, rooted in communities, the work they do, who they work with, the way they do it, the distinctive role that they play. And as a funder, of course, we're a funder, but our strategy is based around 3 pillars: providing core funding increasingly on an unrestricted basis, supporting charities in a difficult world to develop and build their capacity, and also seeking to influence the environment in which they work. These 3 pillars interact and have never been more important than during COVID. But in each of these, to do each of those well, to influence, to fund well, and to support charities well, data, information is all, and learning and evaluation is really important. So as a foundation, we've done various bits of research about small charities, but we know others have too, and we thought there was a real role and value in bringing all that resource together into one place through a partnership, working with others to create one data source, one prime data source on small charities, who they are, why they matter, how they're funded, how many of them, and many other issues. And we've also, vital in this year, want to track what's been happening around COVID to help infrastructure funders, partners and government understand and respond better. Today is about data. One interesting fact is 3 of the people speaking today are from Scarborough. So that's not usual on a voluntary sector webinar, but it's great that we've got that representation today. But without any further ado, I want to hand you over to Alex Van Vliet, from Lloyds Bank Foundation, who leads on research from us, and Kat, who's been the researcher doing all the hard work in pulling together small charities data. So I'm going to hand over to you, to them, sorry, who will talk you through the key elements of what we're launching today. Many thanks.
Thank you, Duncan, and welcome everybody. We're really pleased that so many of you can join us on what is a cold, wintry morning here in London to talk about small charities and what data means and can tell us about their work in a crisis and beyond. So a quick introduction to talk about the two resources that we're launching today. The first that I'm going to talk about is an update to analysis that we at the Foundation published earlier this year, looking at the ways in which the charities that we fund have responded to and the challenges of COVID-19 in their communities, and it's something about the support that they will need in order to maximize, I think, a recovery from this incredibly challenging year in 2021. Alongside that, we're also really happy to be launching smallcharitiesdata.org. It's a digital research hub that contains multiple quantitative data sets that cover a 5-year period with all the best and brightest, latest data about the needs, work and operating environment for small organizations. We think these one of the reasons that we chose to launch these two resources together is because they complement each other and what they can tell us about what's going on for small charities. So two different interpretations perhaps of what data means. A quick word on definitions, as it's always important. Across both of these resources, we take income as below £1 million as being our benchmark, our rule of thumb for what a small charity is. The data on smallcharitiesdata.org is UK-wide. It talks about organisations up and down the country. And the charities that we're drawing data from in our new research report, those are just in England and Wales, and they're obviously those that are funded by us at the Foundation. So I'm going to talk you through, I think, some of the stories that I think emerges about small charities from these two new resources before handing over to Dr. Kat Walker, who was our research partner for smallcharitiesdata.org, who's going to talk in more detail about how we developed the research. The first finding that I want to highlight is the way in which the data highlights how well positioned small charities were in order to respond to the crisis and how that speaks to some of their distinctive characteristics. Data on the site shows that small charities are disproportionately likely to operate locally. That means that they are more focused than larger organizations on a particular locality, a particular community. And it also means that they're more likely to be doing things like delivering services directly to people in a greater degree than their larger counterparts. That doesn't mean they're less likely to do things like run public-facing campaigns or undertake research, but it helps set up the context of why we observed what we did in the way that charities, and small charities in particular, responded to the onset of the COVID crisis. From the research report, the story that emerges from hearing from our grantees is one that illustrates the deep commitment and resourcefulness of organisations in providing a continuity of support to people in a time of great crisis. So in the first lockdown, no charity funded by the Foundation closed their services to their community, and many of them stepped quite outside of their established role in order to meet new needs of their community. So that could be meeting basic needs, providing food, or other forms of support for the first time, acting as a trusted source of information about COVID-19, and working with really the most vulnerable in their community. All of the organisations we work with were forced to adapt their existing services to be COVID safe, acting providing things online for the first time for many. And it was a real source of pride that they were able to provide a continuity of support. And I think it tells us something about the culture of organisations that they were able to do so with such commitment. That obviously did not come without its challenges. Delivering in a new context saw rising costs and complexity as demand went up. And small charities data can tell us something about both the strengths and vulnerabilities of organisations. Data shows how many organisations were financially vulnerable leading into the crisis. So 1/3 were dipped into their reserves in the last quarter of 2019, leading into the crisis. And 23% of organisations with an income under £100,000 have no reserves at all. In the wider context, we've seen a sustained reduction in the funding from government to small organisations, which has declined by 20% over a 5-year period. At the start of the crisis, many funding organisations acted rapidly to make emergency funding available, but there are still very strong concerns in the sector that emerge from the stories we heard from grantees about the ability of that funding to both cover immediate need and the future impact. And there will be kind of health and well-being consequences of the current situation for a long time to come. Undoubtedly, it is a truism that we're now in a situation of guaranteed uncertainty, particularly over the winter. Many organisations and charities of all sizes are projecting a loss of income as a result of COVID-19. But the recovery will not just be about financial resources, as important as they are. We have to ensure that the contribution of small charities is recognised and valued, and it's reflected in how they are involved in a community-wide response and their expertise recognised going forward. Many of our grantees told us that at the start of the crisis, they saw a collapsing of organisational silos and an uptick in collaborative practice in their local area. And we want to see that sort of collaboration and partnership working sustained as we go forward. And one finding that I particularly want to highlight is how bruising this year has been for many leaders of small charities and voluntary sector staff. For the most part, small charities did not furlough their organisations in order to continue services. And those that felt tasked with providing certainty for staff, trustees and volunteers are at risk of burnout, I think, and we need to focus in our support for small organisations on the well-being. Before I hand over to Kat, some kind of broader reflections, I think, on how data matters. We think it's critical to an informed recovery and supportive funding and policy infrastructure for small charities, and that's why we're proud to be releasing these 2 new resources today. There are kind of signs that government have recognising that they didn't understand the sector as well as they thought they did, because some of the characteristics of the government response particularly showed that they didn't understand the need that small organisations in particular would have in order to continue to support their beneficiaries during this time. And I think in terms of thinking about the data that we have available to us, we should balance a long-term view of the sector with immediate needs around data in the face of uncertainty. To introduce smallcharities.data.org, I first want to start by thanking the partners who we've worked with throughout it. It's a project that takes a kind of reduce, reuse, recycle approach to evidence, trying to squeeze value out of knowledge that already exists. And in doing so, we've worked with a wide range of kind of voluntary sector partners. It's been our honour to kind of convene and lead a group of organisations through this process. And I particularly want to thank actually Lisa Hornung of NCVO, whose support and kind of feedback throughout this process has been critical to kind of shaping the project. And I'll hand over to Kat, who's going to talk about the process of developing the resource.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. So way back in August 2018, Lloyds Bank Foundation convened an initial meeting of stakeholder organisations, and these were organisations working with data pertaining to small charities. And that meeting was in order to test the appetite for a collaborative research project. And obviously there was a large appetite for this. So I came on board in July 2019, and then the web designers Outlandish got involved at the end of January 2020. And the lofty aim of this group was to boldly build a small charities data hub, as we called it back then. And today that dream is realised as the Small Charities Data website. So well before the COVID-19 pandemic reared its ugly head, this was already an important thing to do. why do we think that? Why does small charities data, what does small charities data bring to the table? Well, firstly, I'd actually argue that it brings the table because it provides the first ever broad tableau of evidence on which the small charities sector can line up its serving dishes to best feed the hungry masses. And it pulls together multiple data sources on small charities into a single, easy to use one-stop shop. For ease of access, it organises the data around a number of critical themes, offering insights into different aspects of everyday life for small charities. And not only does it showcase the best existing analyses, but it also offers new combinations and breakdowns of data from a range of sources, combining time series data and breakdowns by place and cause to illuminate the specific context of small charities operating, the specific context that small charities operate in. And lastly, it highlights the distinctiveness of small charities using comparative data to show contrast with larger charities. Now, of course, the arrival of the pandemic has made having an evidence base all the more pertinent, urgent, and important. Now, as I'm sure many of you will know, gathering together data on small charities is not without its challenges. And in particular, in doing this, we faced three main methodological issues. The first one was that different data sources use different definitions and methodologies. So firstly, there's no single universally accepted definition of a small charity. So as Alex has mentioned, we took the lead of the majority of data sources that we drew on for the site and defined a small charity as a voluntary or community organisation with an annual income of less than £1 million. However, even there, we had to have some inbuilt flexibility because several of our data sets stray a little outside these boundaries. And we decided not to exclude them on the grounds that the insights gained outweighed the neatness of a very narrow definition. But where this happens, we've tried to make it very clear on the site. Secondly, we faced the issue that different data sets covered different time periods. So in the end, we elected to publish the latest available data from each source in order to give the most up-to-date picture of what's going on. We also provide 5-year trends for comparison where possible. And to avoid confusion, we always make clear the year that data was collected and published. Our third main issue was that different data sets cover different geographical areas, again, as Alex has alluded to. So while the website covers the whole of the UK, you will find that there is more detail available for small charities registered in England and Wales. Now you can find more details of all of this methodological stuff in the methodology section on the website. So how did we approach bringing together all these different sources of data about small charities, besides with a lot of caution and trepidation? Well, firstly, we spent a long time with our data partners identifying the critical themes around which we were going to organise the data. We asked ourselves, what would people most want to know about small charities? And what data could we find to answer those questions? So we did a big data trawl of many potential sources of evidence on small charities, and we talked to a lot of people up and down the country. And the data sources we looked at included government administrative data, financial data from annual accounts submitted to the charity commissions, representative national surveys of charities, surveys of members of infrastructure organisations who represent small charities, and also open data. We wanted to have a broad spread of different data sources, but we also wanted to focus on those sources which could give us an annually updated or biannually updated picture of what's happening to small charities so that we can monitor them over time. And that's obviously very important, particularly now, so that we can provide a tracker of how small charities are coping with the current circumstances. Lastly, of course, we were after data that was representative, robust, and up to the minute. But we also live in the real world. And of course, some data are more robust than others. But we have worked hard to make all of that visible on the site so that people are aware. Our mantra was to gather the latest and best available data to portray a broad view of the small charity sector in all its variety and glory. Because we think bringing together different types of data in this way helps to tell the whole story of small charities. So just a little bit about how the data is presented on the site. It's organised into three main categories that you'll see on the right-hand side there: insights, causes, and places. So in reverse order, places, as you'd expect, deals with geographical differences. Causes deals with differences by subsector. And the insights section is where you'll find the data analyses gathered around our critical themes. And the themes range from things like skills and capabilities, looking at the unique skill sets of the small charities workforce, their limits and advantages, to a lot of financial analyses and the main challenges facing small charities, including special topics such as equalities and the effect of COVID-19 on small charities. So there you can learn, for example, how grant makers have supported small charities during the pandemic, with 81% of grants going to small charities, representing 57% of the total value of COVID-19 emergency grants so far. You can also navigate COVID-19 grants by region in our place pages. So what does the data tell us? The data presented in the website forms a robust picture of the great strengths of small charities, but it also highlights some of their challenges and weaknesses. For example, we look at the digital capacity of small charities before the COVID pandemic, which is obviously having huge repercussions right now for service delivery. And there you'll find figures that highlight that 3/4 of small charities lack the most basic equipment for digital working, such as laptops and tablets. The data also highlights, if we weren't already aware, that we really need to be careful about describing small charities as a monolithic group. There are over 160,000 registered charities in the UK that are small by the definition of having an income of under £1 million. And that's 96% of the total number of registered charities. And obviously within that group, there's a huge amount of diversity, which we've attempted to highlight where possible by breaking down into smaller income bands. But I think, in fact, it could be argued that so-called small charities are actually the norm in the sector. They're just charities, and it's the large charities that could be differentiated as anomalies by their size. So following on from this, the data highlights that within the small charities group, the very smallest, those with an income of under 100,000 a year, do have markedly different challenges, strengths and needs. And just one example of that is that almost 1/4 of these have no reserves at all to dip into to sustain them during challenging times. So I'm now going to hand back to Alex to talk to you about how we can maximise the value of the resource going forward.
Thank you, Kat. I want to highlight, I guess, a couple of use cases and audiences for this work that we thought about when we were planning the resource. We think that the nature of this website, the research that it brings together, will have particular value for funders, for infrastructure organisation and for policymakers as they seek to understand the context in which small charities are working and plan how they can help them recover from what has been an extraordinary year for all of us. Two things that I wanted to highlight in particular was the extent to which the website can help inform both the kind of regional analysis of what's going on for organizations and a thematic analysis. And there are two examples here that I want to highlight, which is that the website contains detailed data around what's the profile of small organizations and their work by government office region. And the example on the screen here is of the great region of Yorkshire and the Humber, well represented on our panel today. And the other aspect that I want to emphasize is how we can learn more about the thematic needs. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that we are particularly hoping to highlight the needs of small organizations around their digital practice, something that we've seen incredible progress in this year in terms of how well organizations are set up to deliver digitally, but where there will be key to embedding a kind of sustained improvement for small organizations in the way that funders, infrastructure organizations and others are hoping to kind of support organizations throughout the next year. I encourage you to play around with the website, go delve into the findings and come back to us with any feedback or insights that you find particularly interesting. A kind of quick word on the future of this resource before I hand over to Duncan for the Q&A. I want to emphasize this is version 1.0 of this. We're committed in our kind of broader research agenda for improving the knowledge around small charities, to updating and refreshing the data on an ongoing basis. I think it's true to say that we think that the data infrastructure of this voluntary sector can lag behind others, but what I've seen this year is a really encouraging headwind in the way that people want to approach data, and especially from organisations like the Charity Commission, who've recently upgraded the registry, and initiatives like the Data Collaborative led by Catalyst. But these initiatives need to work for small organisations, and we want to emphasise that often the data conversation feels like it takes place among larger charities, and there will need to be good coordination around things like definitions and standards to leverage the value of data sets. From our part as a funder, we're going to use this as a resource to think about how we can plug knowledge gaps in future years. We want to use this quantitative picture that comes through small charities data to complement where we can understand where we need kind of qualitative pictures as well. So that's why we've chosen to launch the story of how our grantees have responded to COVID in parallel today. Thank you for listening. I hope you've found it as fascinating as we do. I'm going to hand back to my colleague Duncan for the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Alex and Kat. We've got some questions already in the Q&A, and we'll pick up those in a bit. Some issues around methodology and classification. So Alex and Kat, be on your guards to ready to respond to those. But we want to take some a couple of broader responses. We're delighted to be joined by Sarah Vibert from NCVO and Rita Chadu from Small Charities Coalition to respond to the research, but also how it reflects their own experiences. I'm going to ask Sarah first. Sarah joined NCVO at the start of the year. I think she's had a first year that she wasn't quite expecting, like many around 2020. She has worked and volunteered in small charities, so she understands them well. But also at NCVO, she's responsible for membership, where of course many thousands of NCVO's members are small charities, and she's responsible for data and research, in particularly the annual almanac, which is such a key source of data for this hub and more generally. So I'm going to ask Sarah to say a few words, and then I'll introduce Rita. Sarah.
Thank you, Duncan, and hello everyone. So I just wanted to start by saying just how much I've enjoyed working with Lloyds Bank Foundation on this project. This is really the sector at its best, isn't it, when we come together and create a shared resource like this. So yeah, 92% of NCVO's members have an income of under £1 million. So this is a hugely important area of work for us. And I just wanted to start my reflections by celebrating the role of small charities during COVID. We know our small charity members are nimble, which has been so important during the pandemic when services have had to pivot overnight. And as Alex said, the local focus of many small charities has been essential in responding to the emerging needs through the pandemic. So one of the great things about seeing a hub for data like this is that it can continually be added to. And our most recent research at NCVO has been our monthly COVID voluntary sector impact barometer, which we've worked on with Nottingham Trent University. So ahead of this session, I looked at the data we've gathered for charities with an income of less than £100,000. Sorry, Kat, I have used a different definition already. And the findings are very much in line with what we've already heard today. So service demand has increased more for smaller charities, so 50% of smaller charities with increased demand compared to 40% of all charities surveyed. And more small charities are reporting a deteriorating financial position compared to all of those surveyed. And more small charities expect further deterioration of that financial position. Another thing I wanted to reflect on briefly was the importance of good data and having a resource like smallcharitiesdata.org. So a few days before the first lockdown, NCVO was invited, along with lots of our partners in the sector, to what became the first of many meetings between sector representatives and the Minister and the Office of Civil Society. And the main exam question in preparing a briefing ahead of this meeting was, how is COVID and lockdown going to impact on the charity sector's finances? And behind this was a multitude of different questions: what reserve levels are held, what types of charities are going to experience more demand, what types of charities have had their funding most impacted by social distancing. And I'm really proud of the work that our own research team did early in the crisis, but also working with Charity Finance Group, Chartered Institute of Fundraising, lots of others in the sector, to really trawl the data and trawl our almanac data set to try and answer the many questions that government were asking of us. And the £4 billion figure that we came up with is still referred to now, and it was based on what is one of the most comprehensive data sets in the sector. But I think it's important to say this data wasn't perfect, and it showed we need better data as a sector and better data about the sector. My last role was running a small charity, a small umbrella charity, and we supported people with brain and spine conditions. And I think probably our most important project as a charity, working with our mainly small charity members, was to run a survey of over 10,000 people. And we did this because it was the only way we could make the case to decision makers about the need for more investment in our area of work, in health and care. So put simply, in policy and campaigning terms, data provides the evidence with which to influence change. And so this new source of data will be so important in doing this going forward, particularly as we make the case for the role of small charities as an essential part of our social infrastructure as we build back next year. And yeah, just to kind of add another kind of quote from Oliver Dowden, when he sort of praised the efforts of the sector the other week to produce better data, he said, without understanding the sector, we can't support it effectively. So I'll let Rita come in and give some reflections now.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. Yes, Rita from Small Charities Coalition, who've been working so closely with NCVO and many others as part of Never More Needed Coalition. But of course, you are a small charity yourself, so you know everything about the precariousness of that, of delivering to the max whilst your finances are a struggle too. So Rita, your response would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you for the invitation to contribute both to the hub itself and to this session today. So I'd start off by actually just kind of putting this in context and remembering that charities, and actually small charities in particular, are always in the business of hope. And it's their full-time preoccupation with their beneficiaries, hoping for a better outcome for their beneficiaries, as well as offering and often hoping for continual funding and sustainability. But amidst all of that hand-to-mouth existence as a charity, it is often the case that actually the time to reflect, the time to learn, the time to invest in sharing information, it goes amiss. And I think this hub, and actually indeed the report today as well, are invaluable in allowing organisations to create, small charities to create a space where they can reflect, where they can consider and measure themselves to some extent in a light touch way against what else is going on in the sector. And I think for that, the hub is extremely powerful. There is no other place at the moment that you can go to. It's quite right that the hub starts off with the slogan, the go-to place, because centrally we do need, as small charities ourselves, a space to contribute to the wider policy discussion. And this brings me on to my second point around the value of data in its broader context, but in particular at the moment within the context of campaigning and lobbying, as Sarah has just alluded to as well. And I think I may upset some attendees on this call, and for that I apologise, but I am going to be honest in my views here. The government has struggled to understand charities full stop, but it has a bigger struggle to understand modern day charities. And I think data that's collected in a centralised spot that allows for a variety of sources to complement it, that allows for a variety of different organisations to contribute to it, does actually paint a more richer picture than actual single organisational surveys can do by themselves. And I'd encourage anybody from funders and from government to actually look at this hub as a resource and to rely on its confidence and its expertise in being able to give you the best and most recent information around small charities. I think the distinction between insights related to an organisation's capacity, its organisational development needs, the focus on causes and places is perfectly pitched for where small charities are at the moment. My only caveat to that would be that actually let's not also forget small charities that are working at a national level, where the link to place may not be as potent or as significant as it is with others, but nonetheless they're working on some very important, in many cases, health and social care issues as well. And I think one of the other challenges that we have, and it's come across in a couple of the questions so far as well, is what's the place for qualitative data in this discussion as well. And I'd like to see the hub understood as a part of a continuum about discussions and research in the sector as well. So let's also not forget that actually, you know, data sparks off conversations, and it's those queries, that curiosity that you use when you're having, when you see data sets in front of you, that sparks off conversations as well. So, I mean, just to sum up, I would think this is a fantastic start to a very urgent conversation in the sector, and something that I think that all of us can afford to be involved in and should be engaging with as well. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Sarah. Particularly your final comments there, Rita, were really powerful about, firstly, this is the starting point, and there have already been some great offers in the chat to say, is there other data that can be added? We also know there are gaps, particularly around some equalities issues and the depth of understanding there is. Secondly, that qualitative data is really important too. The sector is often quite good at telling case studies and qualitative information, but it needs to add that to data too. And thirdly, though, any information, any data only gets you so far. We also need to be able to translate it to ways that engage politicians, policymakers and others to persuade them to act differently. We've now got about 15 minutes for discussion and responding to some of the questions. There's some great questions in the chat, in the Q&A. Please post any others if you want to, but I'm going to bring in, first of all, Alex and maybe Kat too, to respond to some of the questions about some of the data questions. I think probably the answer is going to be, at the moment, there's some limitations around what's possible, but there's some questions around equalities, ethnicity, health and mental health distinctions. I just wondered if you could give us a view on those.
So we do have an insights page that relates to data on equalities. I will say it's an area where we lack, I think, good shared standards for data collection across the sector. But there is some data available, and we're involved in a number of initiatives at the moment that are seeking to improve from a funder perspective how we collect and organise data around diversity, equity and inclusion issues. And that's going to be important to understanding what shape the recovery takes for different segments of the small charity sector next year. I think around causes, we've always, I think, struggled as a sector to get the way that we collect data to accurately reflect the wide range of things that organisations do and the issues that they work on. And I think it's quite true that many organisations work across a range of causes and with a range of beneficiaries. And we don't necessarily have reliable ways of grouping organisations that reflect that diversity. And there isn't often kind of agreement on what our kind of on how we talk about and think about subsectors. So there are some critical ones where we don't have good data on, for example, so around organisations working on domestic abuse or organisations working in the criminal justice sector, where there isn't a kind of an infrastructure that allows us to understand the dynamics of those sectors in particular. But Kat, I don't know if you want to come in on any of those questions.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of add the obvious, that we were in trying to bring together lots of different data sets, we were obviously hampered by trying to find common ground that they could all sit on. And unfortunately, that means that to get this first version of the site, as we've said, it's very much version 1.0, but to get this site up and running in the first place, we had to agree on a sort of common set of criteria, which ended up being, you know, the most commonly used ones. For example, the most commonly used cause list, where people have done a lot of work working those cause lists out, thanks to NCVO and other organisations. So obviously this site, as it stands now, cannot be all things to all people. We wish it could, but you know, that would be an incredible undertaking. And of course, people will always want more detail on more things, and you know, we will try to add things in as we go along. But to be honest, we're just really glad to get it up in the shape that it's in now, and we will add to that.
Thanks, Kat. I think there's a feedback function on the site, so if people have comments to respond, and we will also, there's quite a lot of secondary material linked, so individual reports. Clinks have just put out a report this week looking at the criminal justice system, and other reports on specific sectors we will put there. Make it a one-stop shop, not least for small charities themselves, so we know who are our key audience and we know who are hard pressed to find everything in one place. I'm going to broaden the conversation out. There's a good question here, which responded to something you said, Alex, but I'm also going to ask Rita and Sarah to come in too, which was a response to Oliver Dowden's comments that he said that Oliver said he thought the government hadn't really understood the charity sector, and what more might we mean by that, and what could we do to help them better understand. I'll go to Rita first, then Sarah, then Alex. Rita.
Thank you. So I think, you know, it's very honest and very brave to admit that actually you don't understand something. And I think government has struggled partly because of its own capacity during COVID, but also because there is a very outdated notion of what charity is like in contemporary Britain. And I think that's caused lots of challenges with the focus also of COVID emergency funding being on the most on issues of vulnerability. It's limited the understanding of exactly what the scope and the work of that charities do more broadly. And I think because of that, the evidence that's been put before by lots of us on this call to government has been questioned. It's been questioned because it's not been given the right answers, but then that's because we haven't known what questions are being asked. And that's been a perennial issue during COVID.
Yeah, shall I come in, Duncan? Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of what Rita said. I think capacity has been a massive issue, and just getting bandwidth. I mean, even before COVID, getting bandwidth of ministers given Brexit was a real challenge for anybody trying to influence government. But I think there's something about the broader relationship between the sector and government that we perhaps need to consider. So, you know, what are the respective roles of charities and state? How can they better complement each other? We know small charities are often plugging the gaps in public services and have a distinctive role in communities that's different to the role that's played by public services and different to the role played by larger charities. So I think this is where we need to be using the data to really make that case.
There's two builds on that, which is there's a good question here from Rachel Rank about the Charity Commission, because they themselves collect a lot of data but are responsible for a lot of classifications. And I know Rita and Sarah, you both talked to the Charity Commission and wonder, and they've actually upgraded their own website, if there's anything more that they could do to improve data. And then there's a reverse challenge from Rob McMillan, which is a good one, which says governments always say they want more data, but is that just a way of putting off actually doing anything about it? Because they can just say more research, more data, please. If either of you want to come back further on Charity Commission or how government might respond to data.
I'll come back on the Charity Commission if I may. I think the Charity Commission has done a fantastic job on its new search database, and I think that's to be applauded. It does need to be aligned, and they've recognised this themselves, with other key landmarks in the sector as well. So if it could align itself better with the Almanac, if NCVO's Almanac, if it could align itself better with common day understandings of small, which I know is a whole contentious issue as well, that would be helpful. But there's lots of ways that you can cut that small data at the moment the data on the Charity Commission website. That's really helpful to back up and validate some of this as well. The other thing to bear in mind as well is that when we talk about registered charities, there's also lots of other organisations out there that won't feature on official statistics because they're not registered and they don't meet the thresholds.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd add to that is, so I mean, the Almanac data set is based on Charity Commission, well, partly based on Charity Commission data, but one of the challenges we have is the time lag in the data from kind of when we can kind of clean it and analyse it and publish it. So I think, you know, there's probably a conversation to be had, and I think it'd be great to work more closely with the Charity Commission to build on the data they've got and build on the capacity that we have as a sector to gather data and complement that and analyse that, so we can have perhaps more timely data available with which to influence, because that was one of the big challenges at the beginning of COVID. We were using data that was already 2 years out of date to talk about a pandemic that hadn't yet unrolled, and so it was quite a challenge to be able to come up with robust evidence on the basis of that.
I'll just come in on that, Duncan.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that I think the Commission are open to conversations about better use of their data and better collection of data. But I think, you know, we also have to be mindful that if we collect more data, then there's a bigger burden on charities to provide that data. So that's one of the things that can hold this back. But also, you know, data is so difficult, as anyone who's wrangled with it knows. You know, many charities are not specifically one cause or another. They do things across multiple causes, multiple regions. So, you know, you end up with a data set that isn't very easy to disentangle and doesn't always give us very clear views on the things that we want to know about.
Although the faster people get in their annual accounts, the more it helps. There's a really good question here, and Alex, I might bring you in to reflect on our own experience at the foundation. There's a good question actually in the chat with someone talking about setting up a Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led infrastructure organisation for smaller charities, and many of those may be registered or unregistered, as Rita also highlighted. And as a foundation, we set ourselves in our latest funding programme an ambition to reach more Black, Asian, minority ethnic-led charities, and many more have applied to us, and we're actually going to be funding 40% of that funding programme will go to Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led charities. But we didn't necessarily have the data on that. There's an element to which if you kind of open up, people will come. So there's also a question about if you provide openings, then more information can come from those things that aren't already on existing data sets. But Alex, I wondered if you had any reflections on that or generally on other data questions here.
I think my reflection on that is that the decisions that we took around choosing to focus on BAME-led organisations were, I think, naturally based on imperfect data. And I think that's really something that a lot of organisations in thinking about their response to the extraordinary challenges of this year will have faced. But to kind of actually follow up on Sarah's point about using data that's out of date, I think actually that's part of the strength of the Almanac, is that we can balance our need for kind of urgent data collection and more timely data with a long-term kind of longitudinal look at the kind of most robust methods for collecting data. And I think that's something that we need to balance in our sort of conversation about data, particularly over the next year, because a lot of research approaches have been disrupted this year. So some of the data sets that we were working with that have been consistent over the past 5 years won't necessarily kind of have been continued through the crisis of the pandemic. And I think focusing on the value of longitudinal studies is really important in thinking about our data needs.
Thank you. There's a very specific question that's come up a couple of times about the advice sector and where does it fit in data categorizations. Kat or Alex, do you have a view on that?
Well, again, it's one of those sectors that there is no set answer to that. It depends whose methodology you're following. So unfortunately, on that basis, I mean, we haven't specifically included it in the same way that we haven't specifically included other breakdowns. I think someone mentioned charities dealing with LGBT issues and mental health that we talked about earlier. So it's, the best we can do right now is to provide links, as we were saying before, to specific data that is available on those sectors, because in order to keep the website as easy to use as possible, we need to use those broader categories. So sorry, I know that's not a very precise answer, but that's the way it is.
But it's a good request that those of you who have individual data sets, please do send them our way and we'll do our best to put them in. We can't include them in all the graphs, but we can include them on the site as a resource. I'm just going to ask Rita and Sarah if they've got any final reflections. And this is probably a cheeky question, but kind of, do you have any, what's your favorite bit of data or information, or you think the most useful bit of information that you use in your day jobs?
Wow, that's a question. So, I mean, my final reflections would be a year. I've been in CEO for 18 months now. And when I came into post, one of the first things that was said to me was, don't bother surveying small charities. They don't engage. They don't know the answers. They haven't got the time or the capacity. And I think this data, the collection of all the data that so many of us collect coming together in one central spot demonstrates that small charities do want to be heard and do want to be seen. To answer your question about what my favorite data kind of snippet is, I'm always surprised because we survey our members a lot, at least one survey a month, and our members are generous enough to respond, and our lowest turnout response to a survey has been about 500. I think it's the enthusiasm of the responses that always encourages me that collecting data is the right thing, and the fact that for every quantitative survey that we put out there, the fact that we get so many comments and a qualitative discussion follows as well means that actually this data hub is exactly on the right track, and we need all to be mindful of actually bringing our collective resources together in one place. Thanks,
Rita. Sarah?
So I think in terms of my favourite bit of data, I think it's maybe quite an obvious one, but that 96% of the sector are charities under £1 million. So I think when people think of the charity sector, the general public, that probably isn't a statistic that they would obviously guess, because a lot of the small charities are perhaps the ones who are working locally, perhaps working more under the radar and not as kind of out there in terms of the kind of big campaigns and things that perhaps the general public associate with charities. I also just wanted to reflect on some of the recommendations in your COVID report, which I really strongly agree with all of them, particularly the kind of need for longer term core funding, but thinking about how that can be really accessible at that community level. And thinking about the role of local government in that, the role of grants in that, the role of social value. I think these are all like really important conversations to be having with local and national government over the next 6 months as we think about kind of building back better and post-COVID.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Alex. This was a bite-sized introduction. Please check out the resources. It is about data, it is about stories, and it's about how you use them to influence others. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, our CEO, to wrap us up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Duncan. Smallcharities.org. It's always been a bit of a dream for me. Duncan and I have talked about it for years. But it might be one small step for Lloyds Bank Foundation. We hope it's a giant step for small charity kind, because we're often accused of not having good data. And we hope that, as we say, this is version 1.0, but this can build a quantitative picture alongside the rich qualitative stories that we often have about the impact of small charities. As Duncan has also said, we're 35 this weekend. And we've always been committed to small local organisations in that 35 years of history, funding something like £500 million into small local organisations. But COVID has really shown their value. As Alex started out, they have met the moment. They've done what Rita said. They've looked at hope. They realised what was needed. They delivered it and they acted on it. But it's come as a huge cost. As Sarah has said, they've seen an increase in demand, and that cost has been both financial, it's been human. We're really concerned about the stresses and strains on leaders in small charities, going into a period that will also be incredibly busy over the next 6 months and a year, 2 years, as we see the economic fallout of COVID. And thirdly, COVID has shown that their future is in jeopardy. 2021 will be one of the most difficult years for small charities. So it's really timely that we've launched this now. I think we need to think about this as the track, trace and test of small charities. Your job now, if you're on this call, is to act. So we wanted you to go forth and multiply. If you're a small charity, use the data, use it to influence what's going on in your area, use it to influence local commissioners. And here my clock as it's going off. I've got a clock, it's nearly 12, but I've got 2 minutes, it's slightly fast. If you're a funder, use the data to follow it. Use it to influence what you do, but also add to it, because as funders, we realize that we have really current data. Ultimately, hard data will always be 1 year, 2 years out of date. Use this to add to that, but add your qualitative data, the rich stories that you will have of what's going on in the ground, so that we can add it to the data set. If you're an infrastructure body, help it to tell a story. Never more needed. We really need you to help to tell a story. As Sarah has said, that actually 96% of charities are small, and most of them are local, around the corner from people. And that includes policymakers, politicians, civil servants, local government officials, town halls, councillors. We need them to use the data to listen, to recognise and to respond, to recognise actually the crucial value of small local organisations and small national organisations to respond to COVID, and to help society respond to COVID, to paint a picture of what society could be like. So in closing, all I want to do is to thank all of you for attending. It's been really good to have you on the call. Do think about what you can do to use this data to leverage for influence. Critique it, add to it if you can. I'd like to thank our speakers, Alex, Kat, Sarah and Rita, for joining us. Thank you very much indeed. And especially our partners. It has been a collaborative effort. While we were really keen to see this happen, we would not have done it without working alongside the Small Charities Coalition, NCVO, local giving, the FSI, locality, of course, 360 Giving. It's great to have Rachel on the call. 360 Giving has been fantastic as a resource in understanding what's happened. And NPC, and many others actually. So thanks for joining us. Do use the data. Do think about what you can do to help make the case for small charities in an intelligent, informed way that helps to paint a picture of their role as we go into what is going to be a difficult time for society, and especially for the society that most of us exist to serve. Thank you for your time. We will see you again, hopefully soon. Bye.